My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. Okay, there we go. So, did you catch anybody out on April Fools?
I think they mostly caught themselves out, didn't they? No, I mean, we had, obviously Wednesday was the UK column news. I mean, the only thing that sprang to mind was the speech by the Prime Minister given before midday, therefore very much an April Fool's speech. Mike can probably talk a bit more about that, but I couldn't resist producing a slide referring to what he talked about with regard to the Middle East. What was it? Moving at pace for peace. And what was the other thing? Peace and something else.
But it doesn't matter.
Stability. I mean, it was a complete and utter nonsense, but I put, Prime Minister said by the Prime Minister on April Fool's Day. So yeah, no, I don't know. I'm not sure I really caught up with any of the big April Fools that were out there. How about you?
No, I didn't catch any. I actually forgot for the most part. But just out of curiosity, do you have any idea what the history of April Fools is? I mean, how did it come about? You know?
Very good question. And it'll be there somewhere in the archive. I can't remember. It's for the French, it's poisson, isn't it? But I can't even remember why that is. This is not going very well so far, is it?
Each other on the face with fish. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's a reference to the Monty Python sketch. It was great.
Yeah.
By the way, just before we get into our conversation, do you know that sketch was just made up on the spot?
I did not know that.
Yeah, they didn't script that. I remember John Cleese being interviewed about that, and he said that they had an idea of what they wanted to do, but then they just completely forgot, and they just stood there while the camera was recording and then started slapping each other. Which, by the way, often I ask you the question, what does it mean to be British? I think of Monty Python as British, and for me, it's one of the greatest periods of comedy ever. That sort of, you call it a sort of absurd, surreal comedy or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably agree with you, but I don't know that you could actually give it a name.
It was quite absurd.
Yeah.
Oh, look, speaking of absurd, yes, a forced segue, but speaking of absurd, I don't know if you've read that article on Geopolitics and Empire, and Hervoye, you wrote an incredibly long piece, and it's very good. I mean, it's well researched, but he ultimately makes the argument, and why I'm bringing this up is because he does mention us further down, but why I think it's a good article is because A, it's well researched, so he does at least make claims that can be backed. But to steelman his position, he essentially makes the point that BRICS multipolarity is all just part of globalism, and it's a way to create a global division, West versus East, and so therefore, if you're supporting one side, you are still being captured by the globalist trap. I don't entirely agree with everything he says, but I think there is an element of truth to that, which we can unpack.
I completely disagree.
Okay.
Look, this is a massively oversimplistic view of the world. It's also extremely fatalistic in the sense that it absolutely presents to people the idea that there's nothing can be done about anything because everything is so tightly controlled and organized, and we're just basically all watching a play unfold before us, and therefore we should just be non-playing characters ourselves, and because there's nothing we can do about it. So, I mean, this is massively oversimplistic. It's also massively Western oriented and first world oriented. And says that nobody in the so-called global South is capable of, deciding that maybe a different direction is the right way to go. It's also, I mean, my argument would be that when we look at institution, if we want to call it an institution, or organizations like BRICS or the EU or any of these pan-national, supranational organizations, there is a policy behind them, of course, but once you get to the implementation stage, you're bringing in, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people into the mix, and people have minds of their own. Often people have their view of the world framed in particular ways, and so they tend to react in particular ways. But nonetheless, whenever you have been on the receiving end of imperialist policy for 200 or 300 years, it's inevitable that you might be looking for some kind of alternative. And so these alternatives aren't It isn't possible to wholly control them. You might launch an idea as a matter of policy that might be centrally controlled, but how does it get implemented? And so, there's much more complexity to this than just saying BRICS is just another expression of the same globalist mindset, and we should just throw it out with every other initiative that's out there.
Yeah, and I also made the point to him that if you are going to attack our position, which what you just argued, you then reinforcing the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, look, Jerm, I'm not saying that we should all bow down to BRICS, and I'm not saying that we should all bow down to China and Russia. This isn't how it works. Every country has its pros and its cons. Every country has its people that we might consider to be straight, and people that are absolutely as bent as it comes in terms of criminality and corruption and these kinds of things. So we can't look at any of these institutions and say that we should be worshipping them as the great savior that's going to save the world at the end of the day. That's also a massively simplistic view, right? So we've got to be realistic and pragmatic about what these things represent. But also, there's no reason to be just as pessimistic as that article expressed. Our opportunities come whenever we start to see these initiatives arise. And one thing that I would absolutely argue is that the attitude of BRICS to because China, of course, is heavily involved in many of the countries that are on the receiving end of the Belt and Road. But the attitude of China to those countries, and Russia for that matter, is different to the imperialist experience that they've had before. Now, whether it ends up different at the end of the day, that remains to be seen, and that really depends on how, what direction BRICS and the global south take in the not too distant future. And of course, part of the problem here is that they are reacting to what the West is doing, and they're not necessarily reacting in the right way. So, for example, why is China implementing central bank digital currency? That, as far as I can see, is an absolute reaction to the fact that the West threatened to kick them out of international clearing, financial clearing. And so they've reacted, and of course, because we're in a digital world, they have gone that direction. Now, is that something that I am pleased to see? Of course not. But so my point is that part of what we see undoubtedly is reactive to what the types of pressures that they're under from the attack that's coming from the West. That perhaps takes them in the wrong direction. Nonetheless, to just say that therefore it is an expression of what we've seen before from the West is oversimplistic.
Yes, his opening statement. So he says, it has been my belief for years that BRICS multipolarity is nothing more than the next logical progression and iteration of Western-directed globalism toward the long-planned and desired East-West convergence into a singular world federation, world government, and or world state by the transnational class, which is principally stationed in the West but has long since penetrated the East. That's ultimately his argument.
Charles?
I was going to make, I think, a similar point to Mike at the beginning, which is how much should the individual care? And that's not the precursor to saying that the individual should disregard this altogether. But I do think that we have to take the position of believing in what we can do ourselves and how much, for want of a better word, how much sovereignty or agency that we have. And I think I suppose people's opinions differ on how much of that one has in relation to the position that a particular country takes, say, on the world stage. I think it's absolutely true that if you do look at the vast majority of governments, I mean, exactly like Mike has just been saying with what both Russia and China appear to be doing with digital currency, if you take the view that you're going to base your sort of, vision of your sense of self on what your government is doing, that's probably not going to lead anywhere good. And it doesn't really matter which club supposedly they're going to belong to. So I would say there should be a distinction between the individual or critically smaller groupings and the world stage. Because after all, Mike and I, are talking from the United Kingdom, which is completely embroiled in and responsible for much of what we see in the world today, and indeed the other countries that have been prompted to respond to that. We hold that responsibility, but does that fact have to govern the way we think about our own lives and the way we deal with particular situations? I don't think so. I don't think it should. I think it should absolutely inform us, but to suggest that the lot of somebody that lives in a country that takes a different view or that is doing something different on the world stage, that their life should or could be inherently different from ours, I would say is the wrong way to approach it. I think insofar as the running of countries, I think I would make the point that I have made on a number of occasions, which is, I suppose, let's face it, a philosophical one rather than a practical one, because there's not really an example of it not being done like this in recent times. But I don't see that the running of what we would describe now as a country is actually a practical way to make the world work, for want of a better reason. There are many examples, but what's going on in Iran is a perfect one. We've talked about this a lot, both on this banter session, but in the UK column news programme. The effects that the United Kingdom is feeling because of what we believe is taking place in Iran is a ridiculous consequence for the people of the country to be paying. And therefore, why would we enter into a system, a contract of sorts, to have people put in a position where they're paid money to make decisions that have the consequence of destroying many people's lives? It is an absurd position to put yourself in. And again, on exactly like has just been alluded to, all of this, one may say, is on a sliding scale according to time. Just because one country now looks like it's taking a robust or sensible or pragmatic stance on something that appears to be for the benefit of their people, you don't know that that's going to maintain its course. Something may well change. There is yet to be an alternative in the modern sense that's presented itself, but as in some ways, as nation states do appear to disintegrate, the United Kingdom being a very good example, lost credibility, the economy is all over the shop, militarily we are done for. Is this an opportunity for people to start doing things differently and to marginalize the state? One could say, of course, that has already been done by corporations, which, let's face it, are much, much more powerful than countries in very many respects. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I don't know that I don't know. First of all, I don't think I do go along with the line that all countries are in effect sort of pursuing the same thing. I think one has to look at the history and also what they have. What is it that they have? What is it they want? And how does that affect what it is they're doing, or what it is that their leadership is said to be doing? And again, I point back to Iran, the oil in particular, and the consequences for the sort of continued push for so-called renewables and all this kind of thing on the resources side of it. So okay, it's an enormous issue and so many factors. But as I say, I think the main point I would say is how should the individual be thinking about it? Why would you take the view that your country's government should in effect speak for you? They don't, by and large.
I don't think I agree with that, Charles, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly. I think countries are a good way for a people to organize themselves. The issue that we have is that people have removed themselves from that organization process, and we have allowed corporate interests and external interests to take control of our representation. That has been systematically done, that so that people are absolutely disengaged from any kind of concern about how their space on this planet is organized and run. The point that on Wednesday's news program, Patrick Henningsen sent a report from well, he's in Arizona, but he was Arizona and Texas, that he was speaking to people, and there was some vox pops in the report, and one of the people was talking about the fact that for all Trump's rhetoric about not needing to worry about the Straits of Hormuz, that the oil market is a global market. Well, why is that? We have in the UK here, whenever Russia began their special military operation in Ukraine, we had this massive spike in global oil and gas prices, which absolutely hammered everybody in this country with their winter fuel bills that winter. And in fact, the British government stepped in and placed a cap on what people were going to have to pay. And the government paid the difference between that cap and whatever the wholesale energy price was. Well, this is insanity, because this is the taxpayer, whether it comes in the form of an energy bill or whether it comes in the form of a tax bill, the money's still paid by us as individuals. Now, we are a country that has our own oil supply in the North Sea, and we have allowed, because of globalist net zero policy, we have that has effectively invaded this country and taken over the minds of the puppets that are running the government. We have allowed those people to implement that policy and to implement globalization of energy markets, and that has screwed us both ways. And so that has happened because people have not recognized what was going on, because and B, because they have just become so cynical about the management of the country that they don't want to be involved in telling the managers what is expected of them. So that, this comes back to again, this conversation about us as individuals and our willingness to get involved in how we are running the country. And the thing is that if what we're talking about, if I understand what you're saying, Charles, if we're talking about organizing at a more local level, I'm totally in favor of that, but not to the exclusion of at the larger level, because of course larger projects can only be run at a larger level. So the question is, how do those happen? Do we leave those in the hands of the huge corporations, or do we actually use the power of the state to support small and medium-sized businesses to provide that? But that needs some kind of organization. And the fundamental problem is we've left that in the hands of a bunch of idiots, and we've said, that's your problem, I'm not involved anymore. And that we're seeing the result of that more than anything else.
Yes. No, I mean, I do agree. I suppose it depends on what we mean when we're talking about smaller entities or the things being done on a smaller scale. I think North Sea oil is a really good example, because of course that was essentially if we're to understand what I believe is the case, which is that North Sea crude is too heavy for the refining capabilities in the United Kingdom, which is why it needs to be sent elsewhere to be refined, and vice versa. So that's a situation that has.
But I mean, it's not beyond the British to build a refinery that could do that.
Indeed, this is what I mean. So therefore, were things done on a smaller and more collaborative scale, let's say, where the North Sea oil, the idea was that it should be a resource for this country, then it would have made commercial sense for an operator there to have developed a refinery in order to be able to sell that product into the rest of the United Kingdom. That would have made sense, I would have said, in many, many ways. I dare say there'll be people with experience in the industry who might disagree or might provide a business case for that not making sense. But the problem with going elsewhere to do that is that there is an inherent vulnerability, exactly like what we've been saying. You just don't know how a relationship with, say, another state is going to change. I think what I mean is that if, for the sake of argument, there was a refinery in Shetland or Orkney that was able to deal with that oil, it would be a much safer bet, and obviously that's all qualified because there are, sort of independence rumblings and whatnot. But that would be a much safer arrangement to enter into, knowing that you were going to be able to satisfy a local market. And then again, you would also, one imagines, suffer less damage from what has turned out to be an absolutely disastrous national policy to go into what are called renewable energies. And you can see that, if this were done at a regional, local level, why would anyone ever have suggested that that would be a good idea? They would know it was going to destroy their countryside. They would know that it was going to harm their ability to produce food. They would know that it wasn't going to provide the requisite amount of energy. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, we're sort of talking about the same thing. All I'm positing is the idea that without a national infrastructure, a national government, that relationships between smaller entities within what we describe as being a country now, I think would be more likely to produce better outcomes, because there would be, in effect, a spirit of competition, I suppose, both commercially, but also in terms of ideas and dialogue and everything else. I mean, again, I can't really substantiate this, but it just seems to me that looking at it the other way, looking at the way in which a national government may make decisions for exactly, in this case, say, North Sea oil, seems absurd.
That was what I said to Ravoya. So I don't really care that much about BRICS. I think BRICS, as he points out, doesn't really have teeth. It's a very loosely gathered collection of countries. And in that respect, I can see what he's saying in terms of, well, it's a response to effectively NATO, but then you're creating another divisive...
I don't agree. I don't agree, Jerm. No, because how is it a response to NATO? NATO is a war alliance. BRICS is not a war alliance. There's no militarization of it. It's not a response to NATO.
No, but it is part of the global South, a response to the NATO alliance aggression.
Is that a fair statement? Because it's certainly a response to the World Bank and the IMF, and I think that would be a fair comparison, because of course those two institutions have been used to rape countries for a very long time and saddle them with debt that's never repayable.
Yes, and of course, if you are going to fall into a debt trap, rather fall into a debt trap with a country like China that is at least building the infrastructure.
Well, yeah, because the World Bank IMF model has been to say, well, yeah, you need a bridge. Here's the money for it, but by the way, you can only spend that money with this Western corporation. And by the way, we're going to play an exchange rate currency arbitrage thing so that you can never actually pay this debt back. That is one area of absolute distinction between what Western imperialism is and if you're really cynical about BRICS and say that it's another form of imperialism, well, it's a form of imperialism that doesn't behave that way, at least not to this point. And in fact, significant tranches of debt have been forgiven already. So, it's already better in that sense. Actually, in terms of its strength and its sort of cohesiveness, people should be more positive about the fact that it isn't as tight and as strongly controlled and it isn't as cohesive as some of the Western institutions, because that is, part of the problem is once you've got this absolute controlling elite into these types of organizations, that's when they tend to turn bad.
Well, yes, that was my point. I was going to say that I prefer the loose alignment rather than it becoming too tight. And where I was actually going to go is I actually, in principle, like multipolarity. I like what you said, Charles. Competition. Competition is a great thing. It creates accountability. Why must everything be based on the petrodollar?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, we'll sort of wait and see how this plays out. But I think it will be very interesting. And again, I know we've talked about it before, but the deranged way in which the United States is behaving at the moment, I mean, you could say for quite a long time, I think consequences are going to be felt. And we've talked particularly about the comparison with China. So, yes, I mean, that being a country that is not necessarily part of a bloc, a trading bloc, or perhaps a military bloc, I mean, the two are absolutely related, then I think there are definitely advantages to be drawn from that. But we have to I think this decade does look like one in which a lot of this, or quite a lot of this, will be forced to play out for both economic and military reasons. It will be totally fascinating to see what does happen. But yes, competition, if that's what we call it, which I think we should, I think is absolutely healthy. And in the same way that any relationship is subject to change. I mean, I was in Portsmouth last week. I went to the Royal Navy Museum, and it's just bizarre now to be entering into the coalition of the willing with France and all this, all these sort of
our ancient enemy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's the same. You go into any museum anywhere in the United Kingdom, and it's all about slaughtering all our European allies and all these glorious and noble battles that we fought for hundreds of years, and now we're all allies. So again, my point about you just don't really know what's around the next corner, and so going back to North Sea oil, at the moment, it seems like a great idea. Let's ship all the oil across to wherever because we've got friendly relations with them now. Well, you just don't know. So how to future-proof against that? Of course, very difficult. But exactly to your point, Mike, looking inward, and I think without wanting to bring up a sandbag, but the standout example I would say is China in this respect. Okay, a huge landmass, incredible resources, but the ability to match what you have with what you're going to do in order to get to where you want to go. And I think that countries have rather lost sight of that. Of course, that's why one of the key reasons for empires starting in the first place, because you had the idea of what you wanted to do, but you didn't necessarily have the wherewithal, which meant that you had to go and seize it from elsewhere. Now, you could say that hasn't changed even one bit. And I think that's sort of at the heart of what we're talking about, but the fundamental difference now is that the natives are more troublesome. Let's say you cannot go and project with minimal engagement in the same way that that you used to be able to do. Thank goodness. Although the result is, of course, extremely complicated.
Natives are restless, isn't that the idiom?
Probably.
Or the other one, the peasants are revolting.
Yes.
Not enough, though.
No, indeed not
enough.
Look,
I'm in a country that's part of BRICS, and I pointed out to Roy that I actually like the benefits. There are obvious net benefits at the moment. Our trade relations with China are very, very good. We've got 0 tariffs on so much stuff, whereas the United States are making it impossible to make it a friendly trade relationship. Now, why on earth would I see that as a bad thing if I have a good trade relationship with a fellow BRICS country?
You shouldn't, so long as that relationship remains equitable, and that's of course up to South Africa to make sure that it stays that way. I mean, China is absolutely selling the BRICS and the Belt and Road as being win-win. And so far,
but where is the loss? If you're going to approach it with a cynical...
there are examples of loss. I mean, there are examples of loss. I mean, for example, cobalt mining is an example of loss because that is one area where there's a demonstration that BRICS countries and China are quite happy to go into a country and use child labor and not really care too much about health and safety for the product that they're pulling out of the ground as cheaply as possible. So I mean, there are examples of where it's definitely not doing the right thing. But does that mean that you abandon the whole content? No, I think you should be focusing on that instance and dealing with that instance. But while there are clear benefits for countries in the global south to being part of BRICS or being involved with the Belt and Road, I think where I perhaps agree with the article is that there are a lot of people in the West that are viewing BRICS as being the answer to all their problems, and it's again back into this mentality of looking for this knight in shining armor that's going to come and save the world. This is where I would agree with my understanding of what Charles is saying, that we should not be looking for somebody else to come along and solve, or some other institution or some other system to come along and solve the problem for us. We've got to do that.
Yeah, there's an interesting nuance also in the article. He makes the point that the whole BRICS collective is by design. It's not a response. In other words, it's a proactive measure rather than a reactive measure. I'm not sure if I agree with that.
But who's he saying? Who is he saying that? Sorry.
Well, effectively Western interests, the Pentagon, whatever.
And what evidence is provided for that?
It's more correlation based on multiple.
Correlation is not equal causation. For me to accept that argument, I would need to see actual evidence that BRICS is a Western construct, because I haven't seen any evidence for that.
I also haven't seen any evidence for that, and I think that the correlations, while they do exist, I think they're quite loose.
So
but I mean, if you think about it, right? At some point, if you are going to, for centuries, dominate, if you're going to have a monopoly on something, there is eventually going to be a response. And if you say, and Vanessa makes this point a lot when she's referring to Iranian response or Lebanese response or whatever, they like to always say, the Chinese helped or the Russians helped, and it removes the agency of those exact people, as if they are just so helpless they can't respond. The BRICS countries. Yeah,
this is a massively Western-centric view of the world, and it's actually discriminatory in a sense. Look, BRICS could not have happened 40 years ago because China was not in a position to drive it. So in a certain sense, BRICS is the result of Western policy, because the Western policy was to export our productive capacity to China for the cheap labor. And in the process, we exported a heck of a lot of intellectual property, and we absolutely gave China the opportunity to take advantage of that. And I believe they have done that spectacularly well, because they've come along and they've said, right, well, if these countries are going to attempt to exploit us, then we will be quite loose with our ethical response to that in terms of our treatment of intellectual property and so on. So they have absolutely, without question, used the production of goods for the West as a leg up, and they've got some very clever people there. They've taken that leg up and they've amplified it with their own capabilities, and so they are now, they have become one of the biggest, if not the biggest, power on the planet. So in that sense, I suppose the West has created this monster, and so now the question then is whether once China got to the point of having the capability and being in the position to launch an initiative like BRICS, whether that could be argued, therefore, to be a Western construct.
Yeah, I wonder if, Mike, an underlying thread here is anti-China sentiment.
Well, there's no doubt that exists. I don't think it's so much anti-China sentiment. There's a degree of thinking of the world as being run by 300 people, and therefore nothing that happens on this planet ever happens without the say-so of those people. So, if that's how you view the world, then you can only ever have a fatalistic, I'm just an observer mentality. You can never actually be a participant.
Yeah, then just sit back and enjoy the show.
And a lot of people do. And of course, a lot of what we do is, for a lot of people, simply entertainment. But we would hope that a significant number of people see it as more than that.
Well, all I can say is I've got a Chinese car and it's a third of the price of the equivalent European car. So I'm happy.
For now.
For now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. But, the on the alliance side of it, I mean, okay, how exactly it's formalized is neither here nor there. But just to go back, because I think current events are so pertinent to all of this, for the United Kingdom, for example, it is alliances with the United States and with Israel that are doing, well, several things, but exposing our ridiculous level of unpreparedness with regard to any form of conflict. We've had a few years now of discussions around mobilizing for conflict with Russia. And when it comes to it, we can scratch together about 2 warships to head off down to the Middle East, and that's it, with a couple of aircraft. And apart from that, we see that our economy is laid bare entirely because of our alliances with the United States and Israel. We're allowing the United States to prosecute a war with Israel, all the while sharing intelligence and capabilities for their benefit. Now, that is not a good outcome for the population of the United Kingdom. It's not a good outcome for the government of the United Kingdom either. I mean, they absolutely look stupid. They look stupid and weak, and also they appear to have been totally devoid of foresight, because they spoke a lot about having prepared or taken actions that appeared to suggest that they knew what was coming as well, whilst at the same time not making any provision for the very obvious consequences, which of course is exactly what we're suffering now. So these alliances are absolutely fraught with complication, and the so-called special relationship with the United States. What a joke.
So let me just, because I'm just going to act devil's advocate for a second here, Charles, because if we go back to the defense review, the 2015, was it 2015 defense review, and the 2018, I can't remember what the document was called.
Yeah.
And, they were talking about, the idea that sort of legacy warfare was a thing of the past, that we didn't need the big metal boxes anymore, whether it be a floating metal box or a tank or whatever, that we were heading to a world of hybrid warfare with cyber and all these kinds of things. But as the Ukraine war has been prosecuted, and as the Iran conflict has gone on over the last several weeks, were they wholly wrong in the sense that clearly warfare has changed from being something which is where you're using big expensive missiles and big expensive armaments to one of using largely inexpensive drones, where actually having a ship in the sea is just providing a target, and I would suggest that Ukraine has demonstrated that driving tanks and armored vehicles around is just providing targets. So were they wholly wrong in the way that they have approached the situation over the last 10 years?
No, I mean, I would agree with you. I think yes, I mean, I don't think they've articulated it very well, because what's happened now is that they've been found wanting at a time where they're trying to project the idea that they have a credible force.
Yeah, and that is true.
Yeah, and I think that is the bit that looks stupid, because of course that falls in with this idea that there's going to be a whole of society approach, and we need to be resilient, self-sufficient, and all these things that we absolutely know that we're not, and yet nothing's been done on any of them. So yes, I do agree that times have moved on, but then again, it depends what you want to achieve, and this is where the idea of a defence review, or indeed any planning being based on the defence planning assumptions, which are basically a look ahead as to what capability might be required because of the threats that you perceive to be on the horizon. They've never got that right. And so you could say, right, well, you just step back altogether and let's just not enter into conflict. Well, guess what? That's the line that the government are trying to take at the moment, in that we're not entering into it, we're just defending British interests. But we are doing that, by and large, with hardware of one description or another. So, yes, I do totally agree with you that there are many, many things, and I think this is absolutely what's being developed. And, of course, we talked about early warning and use of space technology and all that kind of thing. So, yes, it is absolutely changing, but we seem to be caught betwixt and between, because we're at the same time talking very much about the big bits of kit and actually less so about people. But the problem is, if you've got the big bits of kit and you don't have the people, you can't make kit work. And if you haven't yet switched over and trained people, and you've got the systems, robust enough systems, to be able to conduct warfare differently, then what are you actually doing? So it's an odd halfway house. but it's one, it is absolutely one that was initially, until a couple of months ago, predicated on the Russian threat. And Russia, of course, does have an enormous amount of hardware and people. So the mismatch is terrific. But it is odd, because the idea is, at least the mainstream idea, is that Russia wants to hold ground. Russia wants Ukrainian territory and then wants to roll on through certainly the Baltic countries, then Western Europe, and eventually the United Kingdom. I mean, that quite why anyone believes that Russia would think that would be good or desirable, I don't know. But the point is that requires holding ground. That does require people. That does require hardware. So I think it does depend what one is intending to achieve. And I don't think anyone's really articulating that very well. Look, the Iranian incursion so far is completely chaotic. There's not been any suggestion that there was any strategy either from the Israelis or the Americans. That just seem to have no idea what they were dealing with. And again, if it's hard, obviously it is always hard to tell exactly what is going on and what has happened. But I think there can be no doubt about the effect of the Iranian countermeasures, particularly in destroying very, very sophisticated communications and surveillance and monitoring equiment. And it's very, very clever.
And sometimes things are as they appear. Not everything is not as it appears, which I think is it's a binary trap. It is.
Are we going to start talking about Artemis now?
Hey, it launched. Can you believe it? After promising for 3 months, I believe it launched, didn't it? Last night.
Well, all I could see in the YouTube chat was CGI AI.
Well, I've got no idea, but apparently it did launch finally, and they're going to hover around Earth, I think, for a few days or something like that. I don't know the full story yet.
They want to go and look at the other side of the moon.
Yes,
apparently that's what they're talking about this morning.
Well, and apparently they're going to go further into deep space than they ever have before.
Well, I was saying Ozzy Osbourne found the other side of the dark side of the moon decades ago.
No, that was Pink Floyd.
Was it Pink Floyd? I am so sorry.
I mean, that is disgraceful. That's
quite sensitive. You
dare edit that out. You're not allowed to edit that out. That has.
I'm not a huge Floyd fan, so
well, otherwise.
No, what I was going to say, what was I saying actually? I was saying something about the false binary.
Yeah, about whether things are as they seem or not.
And it is quite clear that Iran is responding in a very specific kind of way. And I can't see how that was planned by the West. It's just, it doesn't make sense to me.
Well, it's only if the Iranian leadership is in the same club as Western leadership. But the first thing that the West did was to kill the Iranian leaders. If that's being part of the club, then the question is that what you want?
Like I said, Mike, I don't actually...
Maybe he's not dead. Maybe he's living in a retirement home somewhere in Basingstoke. I don't know. I mean, this is where the whole conversation gets very, very ridiculous, because of course you can make up all kinds of stories.
Yeah. But
show me the evidence again. And if the evidence isn't, this actually, Jerm, comes down to, what is the journalistic standard that you're going to live by.
Yeah.
And if the journalistic standards you're going to live by is based on supposition, I mean, analysis is good up to a point. You can because obviously there's stuff that isn't possible to actually prove. So you analyze and you look at things with certain, and you decide, what kind of confidence level you have in a particular position. But at the end of the day, if you're making a definitive statement, which is what a lot of people are, in saying that what the global South is doing is, or even people that were, lots of people were saying, taking the position that the Russian-Ukraine conflict was a complete fraud because it's just, the same two sides of the same coin, and that it's a staged event and these kinds of things. Well, if that is the situation in Iran, then as I say, you got to absolutely demonstrate that Khomeini didn't die, for example. that he wasn't assassinated? And if he was assassinated, then are you really saying that this was, all organized and that he was an active participant in that? Well, clearly that seems like a completely irrational position to take. So
yeah, but then you can't really discuss anything.
What do you mean?
You can't discuss anything if there is no kind of conclusive claim, because then it's just anything. Oh, well, what if? Or he didn't really die, or and then we can't. As Pierce Robertson talks about this, he calls it it's the fog of propaganda war.
Yes. Yeah, because what, there is no truth under those circumstances. If your journalistic standard is that you don't actually need evidence for the statements that you make, then anything goes.
Yeah,
and that in and of itself is part of the agenda that we're living through at the moment. The idea of the post-truth world, the idea that there is no truth and that it's not possible to ever find out what's actually going on. And that's only being amplified with the use of generative AI to create increasingly fake content. So
there is truth. I reject the claim that there isn't truth.
Well, of course there is truth, because at the end of the day, something events happen and there's motivation behind those events, but the only people that genuinely know what the truth is for any individual event is the person that commits the act. And so, then anybody looking at that act from the outside, well, they either relying on something which has been written down or something that's being said as evidence, but truly the only person that knows what the motivation was for a particular act was the person who carried the act out.
Look, let's take that article to the logical extreme. What happens if multipolarity and BRICS do become cemented realities? They do actually become very, very strong, shall we say, opposition to Western imperialism. Where does that lead us?
Competition? I mean, do you think that we can know?
No, it's a thought experiment. I like the idea of competition, so I'm not asking the question because I'm opposed to it.
Yeah, yes. I mean, one would like to. I suppose you can take an optimistic or a pessimistic view. You can think, right, okay, well, perhaps this is a good opportunity for there to be some slightly more grown-up decisions being made on the world stage for the benefits of, overlapping benefits. Those that are always going to be looking out for themselves and elites and whatnot. I mean, do decisions made by them always have to be only for their benefit, or is there ever any mutual interest, with regard to the populations of the countries or the customers of those corporations or whatever, if one's to take a very optimistic view? So is it possible that this sort of cementing of BRICS might lead to such an outcome? Or does one consider that there is a shift in the balance of power and BRICS simply fills the void of whatever it is that falls first, and therefore becomes equally difficult to deal with if you're not part of it, or equally problematic within because of fractious relationships and competition occurring within BRICS? I think the extent to which competition or greed, let's say, can influence outcomes is huge. So I think that's always something to be very mindful of. But
sorry, Charles.
No, go on. No.
Well, I was just going to say, the issue here, this again is Western mindset. Even the basis of this question, Jerm, is Western mindset in a sense, because we have used this idea of geopolitics as a weapon, but we've forgotten our own history, because the Treaty of Westphalia, I keep coming back to this because it is the foundation of every modern nation on this planet, was the Treaty of Westphalia, and the first clause of that treaty was talking about the benefit of the other, which is really what Charles has just been mentioning here, right? The idea was that treaty represented a shift in the mindset of the countries involved in that war that it ended, to the point where, they were basically saying, well, we should not be running the world with a view of just beating the hell out of everybody else. We should be running the world with a view to looking at our neighbors and saying, well, what can I do to help? And that if everybody was operating in that way, we would have a peaceful world. And no matter how cynical people are about China and Xi Jinping and BRICS and so on, the fact is that back in 2017, 2018, around that time, he was absolutely making statements to the international community that were invoking that sentiment from the Treaty of Westphalia. And the fact of the matter is that in response, he got more geopolitics from the West. And so that has largely driven the direction that the world has gone in the last 10 years, and certainly is driving the direction that the world is going. So the question at the end of the day is whether you have any acceptance of the idea that the global South would like to see the end of geopolitical machinations on this planet. I think that's something we should all be wanting to see, and that it's dropping that concept would be the first step to humanity on this planet evolving.
Yes, and I mean, I suppose when you speak to people in those regions like Iran and Lebanon, Syria, reality kicks in. It's no longer an article on a website that that's written by somebody in the US. This is the real thing. Vanessa, for example, lives there. So Satari Sadeki lives in Iran, and she knows the reality of what's happening with the US and Israel attacking. But I think what I'm kind of hinting at here is that there's a disconnect that so often happens in sort of academic thought, intellectual masturbation versus reality.
Yeah. It's also there's also Western arrogance about we're better than these jungle bunnies, however they want to think about it. I mean, it's ridiculous to take this attitude about other countries, but of course at the heart of it is the idea that we want what they've got under their feet, and so we got to treat them as badly as we can in order that we can get that as cheaply as we can. That's part of geopolitics that has to change.
All right, Mike, Charles, great discussion. I'll catch up with you guys next week.